You hearken back to remarks that I gave in May of 2018. I remember the response from the world. I laid down 12 conditions. These are the things we asked the Iranians to do, and I quipped that it's not a single thing in that list of 12 that we don't ask the Norwegians to do, right? And yet the progressive left and most of the Democrat Party said these are outrageous demands, things like not committing acts of terror, not taking Americans hostage, engaging in world trade, not threatening our friend and ally Israel, just simple things. And yet this was a bridge too far for the Iranian regime to give them these resources, this money, in exchange for the potential that we delay their program just a little bit is not truly a deal. It's a really bad outcome. Robert walked through this in some detail, but it was really important to remember the things we were prepared to do. When I was listening to Richard Nixon talk, he spoke with more candor than most leaders do. Maybe it was because he was out of office by this point, but he was prepared to acknowledge that he was making friends with some characters that were a bit rough. We knew that if we did this right, we could put enormous pressure on the Iranian regime. We could support the Iranian people in their efforts at freedom. We could make friends with the nations in the region that were trying to get it more right every day. Nations like the Emirat and like the United Arab Emirates. Right? They're trying to get it right. The Saudis, right, making real progress by some standards. That you could shoot arrows and say, oh, it's not enough. You could look at Egypt and say it's not enough. But trying to make real progress. I mean, for goodness sakes, Sisi went to a Coptic Christian ceremony on Christmas Day.
That's the Egyptian president.
The Egyptian president, Sisi, on the Coptic Christian church in Cairo on Christmas Day. We need to be realistic about the folks who aren't trying to kill Americans, aren't trying to undermine the United States of America, are friends with our friends like Israel, and not sidle up to the Iranians. Every $1 billion that we provide to them is $980 million more that is likely to go into their terror program or their nuclear program, each of which will enable them to hold America more at risk.
Well, we have to get on to our main topic tonight, the Iran nuclear deal negotiations. But before we do, Ambassador O'Brien, any final thoughts on this topic before we move on?
Well, the only thing, because Waltz, wound me up as he knew he would. We're going to inflict. We got a self-inflicted Pearl Harbor taking place in this budget. We're going to lose more ships in this budget, and many of the ships are new, or they're like our Ticonderoga class cruisers that are the most feared warships by the PLA Navy because they have 120 vertical launch cells and could be extended for a relatively for 20 years for a relatively small amount of money. And we're gonna lose all those ships, more ships than we lost at Pearl Harbor in this budget. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever.
My view is that Vladimir Putin and his forces would be at the Polish-Romanian border if it were merely a matter of sanctions and international condemnation. But rather, it's the Ukrainians, it's the training that Secretary Pompeo mentioned and he led, and it was such an important part of this mix. And who knows what else is going on in the intelligence world. But I think this is a critical thing. And I think Matt is right that PLA planners are going to take pause, but bear in mind that China's 10x the Russian economy. They're also going to learn from the Russian failures. I mean, if I'm a PLA planner, I say to myself, I take no risk at the beginning of this. I flatten every potential target. I take out everything. I don't let some clever plan of maybe decapitating Zelensky interfere, or Tsai in this case interfere. And I think what Matt is suggesting about the critical importance that Taiwan, I think the window is really closing. Admiral Davidson has talked about this window. We are, from a defense planning point of view, we are already well within that window. In fact, there are things we probably can no longer do in the near term. So I think we're at a point, and this is a real problem with the administration's defense budget that just came out. I mean, you have a president talking like we're in the midst of World War II, battle between democracy and autocracy, and then you get a defense budget that looks like business as usual, that's maybe above inflation if we're lucky, and none of the changes that we really, or very few of the changes we really need to see. So I think, this decade has already gotten really hairy, and I think it's likely to get, unfortunately, more hairy.
Judging on our experience in government with Beijing, they were never good actors. They think of us as an enemy. How do you treat them in this equation as part of these talks? Do you try to influence them? Do you try to undermine them? I mean, how do you view that dynamic?
Well, to Bridget's point, if we when the Biden administration had come in, if it had simply picked up where the Trump administration left off with the Abraham Accords, I mean, what an amazing accomplishment that was, right? We leave in place peace agreements for the first time in a quarter century between Sunni Arab states and Israel, which is also the beginning of a security construct, right? So that's our ticket to being able to focus more resources on East Asia, where Bridge rightly points to China as the mothership. That's the primary adversary that is a lifeline to Iran. It's a lifeline to North Korea, to Vladimir Putin, to Venezuela. So we've undermined our own priority by turning our backs on our Arab partners in the region and trying to cut an unwise deal with the Ayatollah. Xi Jinping and Taiwan, to Bridges' earlier point as well, we're in that window of danger now, right? It's not sort of like, well, in a few years it could get really rough. We're in the window of danger where Xi Jinping may choose to act. And to Bridges' point about some of the lessons the Chinese may be learning, in addition to the fact that they should be reassessing some of their assumptions about how easy a war would be, they're also probably, or quite possibly at least, thinking that, geez, if they're going to go in, they're going to go in big. They're not going to salami slice this thing.